It's been a whole year. Hi.
I haven't seen you in, oh my gosh, I hate COVID.
A year.
Yeah.
My birthday today. This is the perfect timing.
It's your birthday? Happy birthday, Russ.
I know. You try having your birthday whole hamo at Pesach every year.
Well,
I know, no cake.
It's Trans Day of Visibility too, so, you know, this is the day when all trans people are, you know, -2 on their stealth and dexterity checks.
That's right.
So I believe that's how it works, isn't it?
I have to roll my dice and check.
Yes, clearly.
You know, we should do a D&D or some other tabletop game for Hanukkah because it's traditional to gamble.
Is it?
Yeah.
So well, it is lovely to see you. I know a number of folks who are already in here. It's great to see everybody.
I'm gonna mute. But I wanted to let you know one thing is what I've been doing most of this year because I can't do construction.
Yeah.
I can't work with workers. And also most of my jobs have canceled. I've been building kosher coffins all year.
Been building what?
Kosher coffins in my wood shop.
No way.
Mm-hmm. If you know anyone who needs one, just send them my way.
Well, it's a little late for that once they need them, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I've been working with people.
Sorry, funeral joke.
It's true. Some people do actually plan, though.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Anyway, so that's one of the reasons I'm here, and I'm now going to mute my mic and let you lead the group.
Cool. Well, welcome everybody. I am so glad to have you here. I had a terrific time at the very first convening hosted by CBST. My profound thanks to CBST for doing this again and making this so incredibly accessible. I mean, it was so publicized. I'm blown away by CBST's commitment to doing this kind of thing. So let me tell you a quick little bit about myself and this work that I've been doing. I'm a rabbi and software engineer. I live in Seattle, Washington. I have worked for quite some time on transgender halacha, specifically on the areas of changing the name, mikvah, and now most recently Tahara and Burial. And this is a subject that we do not talk a lot about in the Jewish community, period, outside of the people who are actively involved in it and, Hevra, Kadishas and whatnot. But in the trans community, we don't talk about what happens at death and then after death in our own community a lot, because it's such a sensitive topic. It's such a it's so close to home for a lot of us who have struggled with depression, suicide, all kinds of horrible things. And then, of course, the ultimate violence that somebody can do to a trans person after they die is to have them be buried wrong, quote unquote, wrong, and remembered wrong. And this is something that, as the trans community starts aging, we're going to start dying in greater numbers. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing. That's just how it is. And so we're going to need to have some protocols around for how we deal with death in our community. So part of what I want to do is break the stigma around that in the trans community, break the sort of silence around talking about this sort of stuff, which is also a very personal thing for me, having dealt with suicide of my immediate family members, you know, and very, very difficult times of death in my own personal life. This has taken me personally a lot of courage to get through and to work through my own personal issues around all of this stuff. So a lot of this work has been a personal journey for me as much as it has been for, I hope, for the trans community. So this work was done in conjunction with the community Hevra Kadisha of Greater Boston, and has been published. You can find this online on a number of websites. I believe it's actually hosted by Keshet, if I'm not mistaken. I can put a link to it in the chat later if you want to download the entire guide. So the entire guide that we've got here is, we have 3 sections. The first 2 sections are about practical steps for Hevra Kadishas, which is the burial society that has the responsibility of ensuring that every Jew has a Jewish burial and is buried properly. How do we train Hevra Kadishas to be trans competent, to deal with trans bodies respectfully during death? And also, how do we enable trans people to adequately prepare themselves during life so that in death as much guidance is available as possible as to what their wishes are? And the Hevra Kadisha, when faced with a body that they might not otherwise know exactly what to do with because they, are confused about, genitals or clothing or something like that, how can we empower the person during life to try to mitigate some of that in future in this person's, sad to say, inevitable appearance before the Hevra Kadisha? And in the third section is a teshuva specifically about the halacha of, excuse me, let me scroll up here, the halacha of Tahara, which is the purification of a person's body before death, after death, or before burial, and then the burial itself. So what are the halachic issues involved in this? How can we solve them from a traditional halachic perspective? And how can we then be radically innovative within a traditional framework to provide as much guidance as we can to a Hevra Kadisha for how to deal with it when something doesn't go exactly the way they were expecting? So there were a number of questions that we have to address. The first is, and it is terrible that this has to be stated. The first is that we have to say that being trans does not disqualify someone from receiving a Jewish burial. And that's depressing as all get out, that even needs to be stated. And that this is true regardless of the state or completion or whatever. Any other quality of their transition is entitled to a full Jewish burial. This applies to trans men, trans women, non-binary Jews. It applies to every Jew. I have encountered one situation in my own personal and professional life in which somebody had a question as to whether a trans Jew can be buried in a Jewish cemetery. I suspect that for most rabbis, that is not much. I hope it's not a much higher number, but that's a higher number than one. And that's a terrible, terrible thought to have. The section 2 here for by practical guidelines, and there are pages and pages of legal reasoning after this, of halachic reasoning after this, but I'll just share where this is, the headlines of this. Tahara, which is the purification of the body, which is a ritual in which the body is washed and then dressed in the burial shrouds, is one of those things that is segregated on the male-female binary axis in Judaism, and this is true even in egalitarian Judaism, even in community Hevra Kadishas, where men and women take equal roles. There are a number of reasons for why this developed this way. It's not really about modesty from a sexual perspective. I can get into that a little bit later, but suffice to say, this is one of those things where the binary is very, very explicit and is very explicitly realized. So how should we deal with that in the case of trans people? Well, the ruling that I made in this teshuva is that trans men should have tahara performed for them by men, and trans women should have tahara performed for them by women. And it is very difficult to rule in the case of non-binary individuals that they should be performed by non-binary individuals, because there just aren't that many Hevra Kadishas with enough non-binary individuals on them to do a tahara for a non-binary individual when that happens to come up. The Hevra Kadishas just aren't that big, especially community Hevra Kadishas that are not, that would even conceive of having something like that. So when that's not available, we have to make some sort of compromise. And the compromise that we have to make, from the traditional halachic point of view, the conclusion that I came to is that the tahara for the non-binary individual should be performed by non-binary individuals or by women. If a man participated, it is kosher b'diavad. And I want to take a second and talk about the difference between b'diavad and lachatchila. B'diavad means after the fact, and lachatchila means before the fact. One other way of thinking about them is sort of in the most ideal case possible versus in the much more likely but real world case. So in the ideal case, we would like a non-binary individual to be able to be attended entirely by non-binary individuals at the time of death. This is not actually the case in the practical world, so we have to make a compromise. And b'diavad, we would say that if we can even say l'chadchila at the outset that a woman could participate, and b'diavad that if a man participated, it's also okay. And I'll get into the why of that a little bit later, why we seem to allow women to do this and we don't allow men to do this. But let's just take it as read for the moment. We can say that a trans woman is the same as a woman for this purpose. So woman means both trans and cis, anyone who identifies that way, and man means both trans and cis here as well. A trans woman may perform a tahara for anyone. A trans man may only participate in performing tahara for a male, cis or trans. So that's sort of the converse of point B. And point E is a non-binary individual may participate in performing a tahara for a man, a woman, or non-binary individual, and that's how we enable the participation of everybody to the maximum extent that is halachically permissible within the traditional halachic framework. Point 3, regarding a tahara that was begun, but the decedent is discovered to have unexpected anatomy. So this is something that will befuddle Hevra Kadishas when they are dealing with trans people on occasion. They start a tahara and discover that this person's anatomy doesn't match their preconceived notions of what a woman should look like or what a man should look like or something like that. And we need to be able to train Hevra Kadishas and give them instruction in how to deal with this kind of situation. So so under no circumstances, what I'm saying is, should you stop the tahara? You should not stop and start over with a new group of people and say, whoops, we did it, we did it wrong. Now we're all, we're in trouble or something like that. So we say, if a tahara was begun for an individual who was presumed to be a woman and therefore women were performing the tahara, and the individual was discovered to have a penis, the tahara should be completed by the women, right? A trans woman who, during the course of tahara, was discovered to have a penis and was uncircumcised should not be circumcised before burial. This is something that comes up. The issue of circumcision of an uncircumcised male person or person with penis before burial is something that comes up in a number of contexts. It comes up in the context of children who die, chas v'shalom, before 8 days or before they're able to be circumcised. So God forbid that happens, then there's a tradition to circumcise them before the burial. But it also happens in the case of individuals who convert in certain circumstances, who do not have circumcision. There are a number of circumstances in which this can happen. It has happened before. There were, as I recall, 1 or 2 fairly notorious cases in Israel where this happened and sort of caused a bit of a scandal. And what I'm saying here is that if we have a trans woman before us during a tahara and we discover that she is not circumcised, she should not be circumcised before burial, and we should bury her as she came to us. Then if a tahara was discovered, so we have the reverse case. If the tahara was begun for an individual who was presumed to be a man, and therefore men were performing it, and the individual was discovered not to have a penis, the tahara should be completed by the men. So because the general principle is women may perform a tahara for a man, but a man may not perform a tahara for a woman, should we have the men leave and bring in a women's tahara team? And the answer is no. The other is implants in the body, particularly in the breast for women or the neophallus for men, should not be removed before burial. There's a question as to whether or not they should be removed, because you're not supposed to bury the person with any accoutrements or anything like that of life. But the reasoning that I will go into a little bit later for this is because they're basically considered part of the body, and therefore should just be buried as part of the body. Number 4, the decedent should be wrapped in tachrichim, that's shrouds, appropriate for their lived gender. Men should be buried with talit and kippah. A trans woman should be wrapped in tachrichim appropriate for a woman. These customs vary among different Hevra Kadishas about how exactly you do this, what style of knots you tie on the tachrichim. For men there's this like 4-knot thing, and for women there's this 2-knot thing, and or something like that. You should do whatever is correct on either side of that binary. A non-binary individual, and I have written down a schema for how to wrap the tachrichim for a non-binary individual, which is based on sort of the binary between how you do it for a man and how you do it for a woman, and you sort of compromise. You go halfway here. So like I said, traditions vary about tying the tachrichim. And then during the Tahara Pesukim, there's verses about the decedent are said. And it's a little tricky because those verses in the traditional liturgy are very body-centric. Some of them come from Shir HaShirim. They come from the Song of Songs. And, they say things about the deceased person's body that may or may not actually be true. So, I'll give you an example. A verse where I don't know, in some part of the liturgy, there's the tradition of when you're washing the I think it's I don't want to say something that's wrong halachically. I think, if I remember correctly, one of the verses is Shnei Shadayich, thy 2 breasts are as fawns, twins of a gazelle. And this is said over women. And maybe they had a complicated relationship with their body or their breasts or something like that. So what alternatives can we provide liturgically for somebody for whom that doesn't seem to fit? And I give some suggestions in this. I'm doing a quick scroll back through the chat to address any questions before I move on. Before I move on to some of the discussion of this, do we have any questions that I can offer some answers to? Oh, Josie, thanks for putting the link to the page. Hi, Josie. Thank you very much. Yeah, we got to be incentivizing Olivia Tucker. Thanks. We've got to be incentivizing non-binary folks to learn. I would say we've got to be incentivizing everybody to learn. And especially non-binary folks and trans folks. We need so much more competence and sensitivity in this kind of thing. It is just, it's such a niche thing. And yet it happens to everybody. And culturally, it's so removed from what we do. We don't think about this kind of thing at all. So we absolutely need to be incentivizing non-binary folks to learn. And I would say we need to be incentivizing basically we would need to be incentivizing even more people, all people, to learn this too. Would it ever be possible to do a tahara where both men and women are involved in conducting it? Not traditionally. That is not traditionally possible under a traditional halachic rubric. It is permissible for women to do tahara for men, but not men for women. But having a mixed team of people who work together and do it together is just not something that happens in traditional Hevra Kadishas. How no one is really the same gender as anyone else. Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. Right. If it's already happened, it doesn't render the tahara unkosher. How would this account for a non-binary person if they are strongly mask aligned? Well, you can't account for absolutely everything. The best solution here is to leave as much advance directive as possible, and we'll get into that in just a moment. So the same question, right? So a non-binary person, if they're strongly masculine aligned, yeah, it's tricky. This is very tricky. So this is why we need the importance of having as much advanced directive as possible. Is there room in the halacha for a non-binary individual to write their own tachrichim method or parts of this writing? In the halacha, absolutely. How you tie the tachrichim and so forth is mostly a custom, as long as certain guidelines are met. I don't know of anyone who was given advanced directive. Maybe somebody else who's done this a little bit more than I particularly has ever encountered anyone who left advanced directives about what style of tachrichim, or style. It's not, there's no style to tachrichim. It's like what style of I'm about to ask Bratz. Have you ever encountered anyone like that who left advanced directives about how they wanted to be, how they wanted the shrouds to be?
Yes.
You have?
Although it was a long time ago. It was back in the 80s and 90s when I was burying a lot of gay men who were dying of HIV. And quite a few of them were non-gender conforming in their lifetime. And we're very clear that you are not burying them as they put it, a butch man. So we didn't. But interestingly, I have not encountered that since there are a lot of people who are publicly trans. I don't know whether it's because they don't have the halachic knowledge to know they could do that, or they just don't care, or they depend on the Hevra Kadisha to know what to do. Like, I know that my directions include making sure that it's done in the style of a man. Okay. Because halachically, I live as a man.
So yeah, like I'm saying, it's complicated, and we're still at a very early stage of figuring a lot of this out. And I don't have all the answers there, but I suspect that a Hevra Kadisha that had competency around these kinds of issues would do what they could to respect such an advance directive if they, like I said, if they had that kind of training and that kind of competency. So I'm going to skip a little bit of the right. So the first question that you have to ask here is, are trans men to be accorded the status of halachically male or halachically female, and are trans women to be accorded the status of halachically female or halachically male? And the answer for our purposes has to be that however they live in life, that's how we should treat them in death. There is no other answer I can give to that does not offend basic human dignity. And I cannot stress this enough. It is so incredibly violent for a trans person to be misgendered in death. I would even argue potentially even more so than in life. Because in life, one of the principles of Jewish law and ethical practice is that we always make room for a person to do teshuva and to, I mean, I hate the word repent, but to come out of the error of their ways and to, you know, and to learn and grow. And when a person is dead, there is no opportunity for that. And in fact, that's why the very act of burying the dead is referred to as chesed shel emet, or the loving kindness of truth, the truest act of loving kindness. And the answer is, why is it, I said the answer. The question is, why is it the truest act of loving kindness? The answer is because you do it for a dead person without any expectation of being paid back by that dead person, because you can't be, you can't bury them with the expectation of getting a favor from them in the future. I would say, how much more so does this apply to trans and non-binary folks, where the very act of burying us is so fraught with potential for abuse and potential for, as I said, violence, obliteration of identity in a very permanent sort of way. Now it's a little different and might be a little better in the traditional Jewish burial than in some other religions, because Judaism traditionally, and even I have never been I've never been under the impression that even in non-traditional Jewish communities, we don't do open caskets, for example, and we don't do viewing of bodies. We don't do embalming, and we don't do viewing of bodies before burial. So there's not really such a thing as being buried as a man or as a woman, aside from what you say about a person and what you put on their headstone. One particular avenue of violence is a little bit more foreclosed in Judaism than it is in some other religious traditions. And I guess we have to be thankful for small graces. Brett's is pointing out, all the better reason to arrange burial plot and stone as soon as possible for yourself. Burial plot discount comes with most synagogue memberships. This is absolutely correct. Most people don't think about burial plot until it's way too late, which means they don't think about it at all, and then they leave their relatives to scramble for it a little bit right after they die. So yes, having a plot and that sort of thing ahead of time is something that, you know, as the trans community starts aging a little bit, we're going to need to continue reminding people about. Josie asks, how does one deal with families who, Rahman al-Islam, that means God help us, do not accept a trans person's gender or lack of insist upon a gendered burial against the obvious? Yes, one has the recent case of May Peleg in mind here. If you don't know what Josie's referring to there was a very sad case in Israel recently. There have been a couple of cases recently. There was a very sad case recently in which a trans person was completely misgendered upon death and sort of buried wrong. It is incredibly hard to read about things like that. The answer is, we need more people in Hevra. I mean, the glim answer is we need more people in non-Orthodox Hevra Kadishas. But even within the realm of Orthodox Hevra Kadishas, and there's a lot of room for education and a lot of room for the the cultural climate to keep shifting. And if I had been the rabbi in charge of that, there wouldn't have been any issue. But I wasn't the rabbi in charge of that. There's a lot of awful people out there in this world, and I don't have a good answer for how to ever avoid things like that in the future. I would say having as much advanced direction as possible and training the Hevra Kadisha to honor that against the wishes of a family is crucial, because when those wishes conflict with the wishes of a family, almost always, in general, we should be following the wishes of the decedent. I can't say always, because I can think of situations in which we might not want that, but as a general rule, the burial is one of those things that is, like I said, has the potential for so much violence and abuse. And what are we doing to the dead person, or to a dead person, if we don't make an effort to respect their final wishes at that moment of the ultimate vulnerability? Peter Gerber, would it be possible to exhume a body to prepare it for the proper gender if initially buried wrong, or would it be best to just leave the body to rest? Yeah, Brett's is correct. You would probably just change the headstone. The differences between how you bury men and women are extremely minimal. Yeah, extremely minimal. The most important thing is the headstone, because that's what people actually see. And yeah, and certainly also changing that is a lot easier than exhuming a body. Exhuming a body is I don't even want to think about it. I've been watching a lot of Law and Order lately, and it's like, yeah, anyway. Right. So, right. Exhuming the body, we don't do that, trademark, right. So this right here, this paragraph, a Hevra Kadisha may encounter a situation where a trans or non-binary person's individual preferences are expressed in an advance directive during that individual's life. Even where those preferences conflict with the guidelines given above, the ethical imperative for kavod habriot, that means respecting life, respecting creation, demands that the Hevra Kadisha should attempt to honor and carry out those explicitly expressed preferences where possible and where they do not conflict with the halacha. We may rely on lenient rulings as much as possible to honor those requests. An example would be a trans man who specifically requested that no cis men participate in his halacha, in his tahara. Even though this would be permissible in the letter of the halacha, the Hevra Kadisha should attempt to respect that as much as possible, since women and non-binary individuals may perform tahara for a man. So there are situations, someone was asking a little bit earlier about, a number of people were asking about sort of masculine leaning non-binary individuals. Like I said, with proper training and sort of moving the cultural needle on where Hevra Kadishas, how Hevra Kadishas practice, yeah, write it down, and then train Hevra Kadishas to respect those wishes. And that's what a large part of this project has been through the Greater Boston Community Hevra Kadisha, has been to actually establish exactly this kind of training program for Hevra Kadishas that want to do the right thing but don't have the cultural knowledge or background to make it happen. Right. I'm starting to run a little bit short of time. I want to get to a couple of things. Yeah, regarding a tahara, that was begun, but the decedent is discovered to have an unexpected anatomy. Like, what do you do if you do in the middle of the Tahara if you get surprised? Um, uh, what do we what do we do? Um, there's a practice, I said, of post-mortem circumcision of a presumed male child who died, God forbid, before the Brit Milah. And uh, there the first there are two reasons not to circumcise a trans woman who is in the same boat. The first is that since is a very technical, very subtle legal reason, a very subtle halachic reason. The reason is the mitzvah of having a circumcision is not incumbent on the person. It is incumbent, or let me put that another way. It's not incumbent on the penis. It's incumbent on the person. And that's a very subtle distinction. And what it means is that the obligation of having a Brit Milah before the age of 13 is actually the father's, technically speaking, the father's obligation. And then if the father didn't act, it's the adult's obligation. And then when the adult dies, they don't have any halachic obligations to fulfill because they obviously can't fulfill those obligations. And so the question is the Hevra Kadisha acting in the location, acting in the place of a Beit Din, in the place of a court, in order to require them to perform that circumcision? And the answer I come to is just leave them alone, for God's sakes. Just leave it alone. And also prosthetic devices. In situations where hormonal or surgical intervention is insufficient, particularly breast implants for trans women and prosthetic penile implants for trans men. Those are the two major categories of this. I can think of some other cases in which this would be an issue, because the case with bodily implements that are used on a habitual basis, such as artificial limbs or false teeth, and they live with them, right? Same with artificial eyes, things like that. Prosthetic limbs, those are buried with the person because it's part of their body. The question is it do we then, if they weren't on the person's body at the time, do we then bury them with them? It is not forbidden to bury them, and it's not required. You can bury them if specifically requested because they were viewed to be an integral part of the individual. But if no specific request is made, then they shouldn't be buried. Right. And then someone asked me a question some time ago about can we use the binder as part of the tafrichim, as part of the shrouds, which I thought was a very interesting question, because it sort of falls under the same category as an implant, because it's sort of part of the body. You can make an argument that this is an integral part of the body. Someone who wears a chest binder on a day-to-day basis, they may be buried with it, but the question is, can you bury them with it on, because it might constitute a halachic barrier between their body and the shroud. And so, this is in computer science what we call an edge case, or actually technically it's a corner case, because several different things have to come together in order to actually trigger this particular case. But yes, these are the kinds of questions we're going to need to start thinking about in much more detail as time goes on. The decedent should be wrapped in tafrichim appropriate for their lived gender. We said that. And then psukim appropriate for the lived gender of the decedent should be said. So this is what I was starting to talk about earlier. much of our modern liturgical practices about Tahara were codified in a book called Ma'abar Yabok, by a rabbi in the early 17th century. And Rabbi Stuart Kelman and Dan Fendel have a pretty good book called Chesed Shel Emet, which has a history of all of that in it if you want to read it. And the rest of my teshuva actually builds on their book. So a lot of the liturgy as codified in this work and in later works designates verses from Song of Songs to be recited while washing various parts of the body of the deceased. And there are a number of issues that I started talking about earlier. There, the binariness and the overt sexuality of a lot of the stuff in Song of Songs. Yes, I know it's a metaphor about, the people Israel and the God and it's sex. It's sex. There's a lot of sex in Song of Songs. And if that made the rabbis of the Talmud uncomfortable, I'm very sorry for the rabbis of the Talmud. It is a very sexy poem. And that is something that a lot of people, even during life, are uncomfortable with. Like, do we really have to turn burial into yet another, I'm putting on my ace hat now. Do we really have to turn burial into yet another sex mandatory space? So here are some suggested verses, and as I say, furthermore, the sexual connotations of the traditional sex may be inappropriate for certain decedents, for example, children anyway. So we need alternatives for even people for whom none of this applies. So like I said, we need alternatives. So I came up with a number of them. Some of the biggies, that we all know from Trans Judaism 101, like Vayivra Elokim et Hadam b'Tzelmo, God created humankind in the divine image, male and female, and so forth. But also some psukim, and the whole "let not the eunuch say I am a withered tree," another sort of Jewish trans 101 verse that people use a lot. But also, what else can we possibly use? There's a ton of stuff in the Tanakh that we could use. And also we can invoke non-binary Hebrew. We can, and in fact, I wrote down a whole potential liturgy for a non-binary person as part of this, because someone had to do it. The masculine and feminine versions are printed in the book, but what about if you want a non-binary version? To what extent can we avoid saying it with pronouns? That's challenging in Hebrew. It's pretty hard to avoid gendered pronouns in Hebrew. So from the non-binary Hebrew project, which regardless of what you think about it, from the point of view of grammar, or whether or not it's the right quote unquote solution to the problem, it is a solution to this particular issue. So let's have some options available for that as well. So yes, is there a link? Question in the chat, is there a link to this document? Absolutely, it was given at the very top of the chat. I'll put it down again. Please feel free to, thank you. Number of people beat me to it. Yeah, absolutely. Please feel free to share this far and wide with your synagogues, with your Hevra Kadishans and things. I want to conclude here because I believe we're coming up to the end of our time. What I want to point out here is that this is just a first step. I'm not claiming to have all the answers, and I'm not claiming that this is perfect. What I'm saying is, what we need to do is we need to get people like us involved in the processes of Tahara and burial. We need to get trans people on Hevra Kadishas, and we need to get trans people educating Hevra Kadishas. In general, Hevra Kadishas need to be more community-led, as Brett just said. Absolutely, that's correct. But we need to raise the level of education and raise the level of our own community's participation in this, because we cannot trust. I don't want to sound cynical, but we can't trust cis people to do it right for us. We have to do it ourselves. This is why I'm so skeptical of trans halacha written by cis people, even when it's with the involvement of trans people. And this is why I want to see more trans rabbis writing halacha. I want to see more trans Jewish lay people getting involved in Hevra Kadishas, getting involved in ritual creation, getting involved in all kinds of things, because if we can't do it for ourselves, it's not going to come out right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. You can always email me, find me on Facebook, find me on Twitter, anywhere, and I am always happy, night or day, to chat with anybody who needs it, to answer any more questions. And thank you all very much. It was my honor to present this work and to work on this. Oh, email or website in chat, Emily at EmilyAviva.com. EmilyAviva.com is my website. You can contact me through any means there. Thank you all.